This is the Cruciform Conversations podcast, where we explore the healing and transforming love of God and seek to be peacemakers and reconcilers in a fractured world. I'm your host, Greg Arthur. To find out more and engage in the conversation, make sure you subscribe to the Cruciform Reflections Substack at drgregarthur.substack.com. Before we get into the podcast, I just wanted to make sure and offer the disclaimer that during this series, we get into some sensitive subjects. In this particular conversation, we talk about systems involving abuse and other exploitation, and just want to make sure that you know that before you join us for the conversation. Thanks for listening. Well, welcome to Cruciform Conversations, where we are pursuing a cross-shaped life, one where the self-giving love of God allows us to participate in God's healing of the world. Today's conversation is a continuation of the Cruciform Sexuality series. We've been pursuing a sexual ethic that's rooted in and embodies the self-giving love of Christ. And my guest today is scholar and writer Rachel Darnell. Rachel, thank you for joining me today.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Greg.
I first encountered Rachel through her excellent Substack and her work with my friends over at the Agnosticism Center, where she produces some amazing content as a curriculum developer. Rachel completed her MA in Theological Studies from Westminster Theological Seminary, lives in Boise, Idaho, with her husband and two daughters, and a border collie named after Dmitry Shostakovich. Is that correct?
That's almost correct. Actually, poor Shosty passed away in July.
No.
But we have a new dog. We have a new dog.
Okay, are they named after a similarly interesting character?
Not.
Okay.
No, our new border collie is named Kahlua, so she's just named after liquor.
Okay. Well,
yeah, she was an adopted dog, so we did not get to pick out that name, but it is really cute.
That is cute. That's fine. Rachel has written articles on gender, religious authoritarianism, and purity culture for various publications, including Fathom Magazine and Current Magazine. And her interest in women's history and theological ethics drew her to the Agnosticism Center, where she's got to continue her work. And she was just part of putting out an amazing new curriculum series called It's a Man's World, The Impact of Genesis 3:16. And her and her co-author Haley did an unbelievable job with this. I was part of a pilot group in this study. Absolutely fantastic. I was blown away by how comprehensive and in-depth it was. We'll put some promotions for that at the end because they have some new classes coming up if you want to check that out and join in. But really some extraordinary work. So Rachel, how did you come to this place of talking about patriarchy and gender ethics? And your profile on your Substack, you say, my work revolves around proclaiming liberty to the captives of patriarchal legalism by showing that the head to whom we ultimately submit is a Lord who can set us free. Can you unpack some of that for us? Give us a little bit of Sure. What sort of has driven you into this?
Yeah, I feel like I didn't pick the anti-Christian patriarchy life. It picked me. I was born into a family. I'm one of 10. I'm the sixth born of 10 in my family. My parents were very heavily into the Bill Gothard style version of Christian patriarchy and the Quiverful movement, which is why they ended up having 10 kids. Quiverful, for those of your guests who are not in the know, is just the idea that Christians should be having as many kids as they can because they're going to be culture warriors and fight the forces of secularism. So that was my upbringing. Belonged to, if your audience is familiar with the Duggars or the Shiny Happy People, that was the group that my family was involved with. There's actually an episode in Shiny Happy People where you can see my sister in the background in the chorus. So that's just some fun family lore.
Yeah. First my wife, and then both of my children really got into that series. And my son has watched it multiple times. So they just find it particularly interesting. I think of what is this? So that is a helpful little hook and connection point. So thanks.
Yeah, no problem. So I started to sort of unpack or unravel some of that in 2013, directly related to the Bill Gothard IBLP stuff, because that was the year that there were all these now adult women who were coming out and saying I was molested by Bill Gothard, and they were putting their stories up on the website Recovering Grace. And it was just the same story time after time. And then one of the stories was my sister. So that hit very close to home for me. And I already, I never liked Bill Gothard. He was always the guy that was just ruining the fun in my life. But that was the point where I was maybe he gives me the ick because he's icky. Maybe there's something actually rotten here. So that's when I started to like first unpack the very overt Christian patriarchy that was involved in IBLP. But then after that, I was like, well, maybe complementarianism is the right way. This seems like softer and more moderate. But the more that I dug into that, I was like, no, this is just like a rebrand of the same
Mm.
thing. And even there are some things I think that are worse about complementarianism. So that's been a process of probably 14 or 15 years at this point of unpacking all of that. And I started writing about my journey, kind of feeling like I was a part of a very small minority that had experienced a lot of this stuff. But as I wrote about it, I thought I would have people like, oh, this is like a interesting, eccentric
Mm.
experience. But I had just more and more people being like, this was my experience. Either they had been in a group like my family was in with Bill Gothard or something in the same category, or they were just like, I have experienced this in mainstream evangelical churches.
Yeah, I think what's been really interesting for people who may be newer to that conversation or have sort of come into it through their own way. For me, the person who ruined the fun in my life was James Dobson, and for many
Yeah.
of my circles, right? But there's this interconnected web in a lot of these spaces, especially around family systems and marriage. Then, of course, got into gender roles and sexuality. That these interconnected forces that really impacted, I mean, tens upon tens of millions of American Christian families and globally as well. That so much so that like as I join in conversation with people, it doesn't take long to like ask two or three questions to discover where their lives were impacted by or where these ideas were implanted within them about marriage or sexuality or gender or whatever from that same sort of web of ideas and leaders.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of it is just like in the atmosphere. It's definitely a cultural. It's coming from a place of American culture in the mid-century. And so even though like my grandparents thought that my parents were totally gone off the deep end and off the reservation, but they were patriarchal as well in their own way just because of coming of age during World War II and like the
Mhm.
post-war atmosphere. So it does not take very long to go from, wow, this is something really out there that most people haven't experienced before you start finding the connection points of like, no, this is regular American culture.
Well, thanks for unpacking some of that background for us. I wanted to do that because as we dig into some questions that I wanted to ask you around sexual ethics and trying to make sense of what we bring into conversations about sexual ethics, I think that cultural background is really important because it has had an incredible amount of influence on the shaping, forming, and living out of sexual ethics. And as you pointed out at the beginning, how there are parts of those systems and those ethics that have always been poisonous. It's not an exception that there has been abuse or scandal or these elements there. They're actually a feature of this interconnected web theologically and sociologically. And that's part of the work we're trying to do of like exposing that, making sense of it so that we can find redemption for it and find something better within that. So that sort of frames some of the background within it. So let's dig into this first one because I think if you grew up in anything that's associated with this web culturally and theologically that we're talking about, there is a phrase and an idea that was embedded in you. And it is summed up well by modest is hottest, right?
Hmm.
This was youth group talk. I remember having guest worship leaders come in who were wearing the shirt modest is hottest and like trying to unpack all this. But modesty is a dominant part of the sexual ethic that comes out of sort of this background. Can you help us make sense of what is the sexual ethic of modesty? How is it related to patriarchy and fundamentalism? Maybe just begin breaking down that and then we can get into some of the specifics.
Yeah. Well, I'll start by talking about something that's on the extreme end and will probably come across as pretty inflammatory in the
Mm.
context of this discussion. But like I said, when Bill Gothard was accused by all of these women of molesting them, and they all put their stories on this website, one of the patterns in those stories, one of the patterns of his grooming was this intense hyper focus modesty.
Mm.
Modesty as he defined it. And so it would begin as, everybody in IBLP, which is Bill Gothard's organization,
I was gonna say, we've
all,
used that acronym a couple times. What does
yeah,
that stand for
it's
people?
Institute in basic life principles. Yeah. It's very generic and meaningless, but that's what it is.
Okay.
Bill Gothard definitely expected all of the women in this organization, and to a certain extent the men, to present a certain sort of appearance that was very like covered and modest, and the pilgrim collars and what you see on Shiny Happy People. That came from the top. But when his victims would come to him, they were already used to the idea of like, Bill Gothard tells me how I should look and what I should wear and what I shouldn't wear.
Mm.
That made it very easy for him right off the bat to move on to other things like, your teeth are a little crooked. You should get those fixed. In fact, I have a dentist who will do it for you.
Mm.
And just all of these little things that he would pick at about these girls' appearance that was part of his grooming process of like breaking them down and making them feel insecure about the way that they looked, and then feel like it was normal for him to control that about them. And that's what abusers who are grooming their victims do, is to establish control and to cross boundaries. And that's another thing that people don't realize about this hyper modesty thing, is that it becomes a way for people to actually cross sexual boundaries, because you have these men in power who are making these really inappropriate observations about women and girls, sometimes girls as young as like their preteens, and they're making comments about them that are clearly very sexualizing, and that grooms girls and women to think that's normal for men to make comments about their bodies, and that's an abuse tactic, and I think a lot of people don't realize that.
Yeah. As I became aware of this, listening to the women in my life and listening to the stories of women who had grown up in these cultures, it was sort of shocking to me initially. And then I began to attach, like, oh, yeah, I've heard this over and over again, of how normative it was for men in positions of power, or to make comments about women's bodies and what was appropriate for them, not just dress wise, but even like in just having a body and existing in
Mhm.
space, how they had to be aware of that, and how they were reminded all the time that men were hyper aware of the fact they existed with a body, and that this was an issue that had to be controlled at all times.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think not everybody who is participating in those cultures is, a molester or a serial abuser, but everyone who's participating in this system is normalizing it. And it becomes a system where the abuser grooms the entire community, and then the community helps them pre-groom their victims before
Mm.
they ever even get into relationship with them. So I think that's something to keep in mind when people usually react very strongly to a story like that, and they're like, well, that's not me, that's not the men that I know, they're not creeps. And I believe them. I don't think most men are creeps, even in environments like that. But you are contributing to the creep if you're not actively fighting against it and saying this is not normal or okay.
Yeah. So, and you're thinking about then sort of a redemptive arc for that, and conversations around modesty. What is a better conversation we could be having? A more biblical conversation we could be having? A more loving and Christian conversation we could be having that would offer a great alternative to that?
So I would approach this kind of in two ways. I don't like to use the word modesty to refer to anything that has to do with your sexuality, just because the words in the Bible that are usually translated into terms like modesty, that's not what it's talking about, like at all. Those words
Right.
are talking about wealth inequality and
Hmm.
having sensitivity to people who are on the lower end of the economic sphere.
Hmm.
It's not the same thing at all. But on the other end, I do think that, we do need to have conversations about our bodies and our sexuality and how we carry ourselves in the world and how we should look at other people and their bodies. And so I prefer language of decency, discretion, and privacy. Those are the categories I like to think in when I
Mm.
talk about the things most people mean when they use the word modesty.
Yeah. I love that emphasis and divorcing modesty from bodies, and thinking about this sort of ethic into the actual biblical idea, which was in a culture, especially like if you get into the New Testament use of it, that was the socioeconomic divide between the head of a household and those who lived underneath that and the 40% plus of the Roman Empire that was enslaved or trafficked or lived in extreme poverty and debt poverty. Like the modesty was always this chastisement of continuing to keep these divides in place. That you live and demonstrate this in such a way that you are of citizenship or you are of status over and above and compared to, and that was improper for the people of God, especially in the body. So that modesty was, I am not going to take my privilege and live it outside of myself in such a way as to demean others or separate myself from them to reinforce those divides. So let's talk about modesty in that way and not the length of a skirt or a shirt or that's worn or whatever. I think I love that you articulate that so well and divorce those two things.
Yeah. And I think both conversations really need to be had. The first conversation, the one about wealth inequality and how our choices surrounding clothing affect the poor, that is a conversation that is just not being had at all in the circles where people are really concerned about modesty.
Mhm.
In the episode where we talk about modesty in the It's a Man's World series, we talk about issues like fast fashion,
Mhm.
and a lot of those clothes are produced very unethically.
Mhm.
When I was researching, it was just shocking the accidents that have happened in textile production companies overseas. And these are being used by brands that you would know, brands that you
Mhm.
would recognize. That there's a brand that I used to buy my kids' clothes from all the time that I don't anymore because I found
Mhm.
out that they were one of the companies that was using labor from this overseas company that the building they were in was in such bad repair that it collapsed and like thousands of workers died because they
Mhm.
were not working in safe conditions. And so that's kind of the cost of being able to go pick up a $5 shirt at Target, which
Yeah.
I've done. And I think we've all probably done that. And I'm not trying to make anybody feel bad about it, but just maybe we could bring those things to the surface
Mhm.
sometimes instead of talking about the length of a skirt or things that like that's not really hurting anybody. Like I know they'll tell you like this is really harming your brothers in Christ, but like I'm a little bit more concerned about somebody dying in a building collapse than I am about brothers in Christ being distracted.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's great. And tying that into it back into an ethic of justice. Modesty is rooted to justice, right? And mutual flourishing frees us from some of these other trappings. So one of the things you pointed out there, which I think is something I'm really interested in, is in order to have some of the mutuality and that we were just naming that we see in Christ and in the community of the cross and what we even find New Testament ethics is learning to take responsibility for one another, like a neighbor love, and that existing first in the church, so that then we can live that ethic out. And I think that sexual ethics, we have to reconsider what taking responsibility for one another and helping each other flourish. We just have to reimagine that a little bit because of some of these structures that exist. And one of the things attached to modesty quite often is what you said earlier, which is this idea that women are somehow responsible for the sexual purity of men. Can we unpack that a little bit about how that's communicated or the implications of it or where did it come from? Historical roots, any of this? Can you just help us understand? I think that's a pretty common idea attached back to modesty and some of the other things of women cover yourselves because you are a source of temptation and danger for men, and that's you've got to protect them.
Yeah, I think that this idea it has a really long development in Christian history, at least. So we talk in that same episode I was mentioning about Tertullian and how he's the original guy who applied that verse
Mm,
about not causing your brother to stumble to the issue of what women should wear. And Tertullian's modesty ethic is so wildly different than anything that we're used to. But he did bring in this idea of like women are responsible to protect the purity, and he would say that not disturb the peace of their Christian brothers.
mm,
So men should be able to move in the world without confronting visual stimuli that would disturb their spiritual peace. So that goes back to, early Christian church. But then there was also a shift kind of in the late 1700s and early 1800s where modesty became, this is where the modest is hottest idea really started to develop. And modesty was defined as being like kind of like the Goldilocks effect, like not too hot, not too cold.
Mm,
Like you want
mm,
to signal that you're a respectable marriage partner, potential partner, but at the same time, you want to be attractive so that you attract a marriage partner who is suitable.
mm.
And what that usually meant was like in our same socioeconomic status, because this was a time where like it was becoming more possible for couples to be mismatched economically. This was a way of like, you need to put forward the right picture, a picture that is attractive but respectable. And that period is where we get a lot of the groundwork for how we think of modesty today and how we get these phrases that seem very counter, like an oxymoron to say modest is hottest.
Mhm.
Like, if it's hottest, then shouldn't you not be modest?
Right. So with those origins of not wanting to distract, allowing men to exist in the world without this, how did this get cemented or built into the structures that you've seen within more patriarchal Christian cultures and fundamentalist ones where the fullness of purity for men was reliant on and carried by women?
Yeah, I think you see it all over the marriage literature, any kind of like woman's Bible study or teen Bible study for girls. It's everywhere, this idea, and it can be very flattering actually. They often begin by flattering women that like you have no idea how much power you have over men and the choices that you make so much impact in the world because they impact men. They shape male character. So that's another idea that goes back to the Victorian and pre-Victorian era that
Mm.
women's power in the world is primarily about how they influence men, and the way that you dress is a big part of that. So that's how they approach it and how they kind of get women to buy into it is women are, because we do exist with less earthly power, there's always that kind of like insecurity and wanting to be reassured like you have power, you can make choices, you can impact the world. And that's true. You do have choices and you can impact the world, but they kind of take advantage of that desire
Mm.
by turning it around and being like, because you have so much power, you really need to keep yourself under control. And it's a really effective way of getting women to self police.
So in this culture in which we're going to deny you power at this level, this level, this level, and this level, you actually secretly have the power.
Hmm.
Um, and in order for us to succeed, you should deny that power or sacrifice it over here to maintain the power of men and all these other things, right? Like there's this oxymoronic sort of understanding of power at work here within that structure.
Yeah, absolutely.
So if we're trying to get to an ethic that involves mutual submission to one another in love in Christ, with Christ as our head and our source, that we are participating fully together in life in Christ, how does that maybe give us a different imagination for this ethic of how we exist as sexual creatures and our responsibility to one another with what does help each other flourish versus what contributes to each other struggling?
Yeah, I think that mutuality always has to start with the foundation of really accepting and leaning into the fact that we are the same, that men and women are more same than different. So the story of how Eve came to be, we know happened because God drew her out of Adam's body, like took her from his substance. And that's something that can apply to the conversation around clothing and privacy of bodies and everything that goes along with that because there is this idea in men's heads that women exist in bodies in a really really different way than men do,
Hmm.
and that things that would be humiliating or unpleasant for men, like women maybe wouldn't experience it that same way. And that factors into this idea of being exposed publicly. Whenever we talk about women not wearing enough clothes, like immediately the assumption is she's trying to get attention, she's asking for it. But in the Bible, when women are portrayed as not wearing enough clothes, it's usually something that has happened to them. They have been
Mhm,
exposed not as an act of their will, but of somebody else's.
mhm.
And it's something that they are experiencing very negatively, and they're experiencing it as shame, not necessarily in the sense of like moral guilt, but you're being shamed by the people around you. And I think if we can just think about clothing in a human way rather than a sexed way, it would be extremely helpful for everyone.
There's an inner work that has to take place of making sense of how we have been shaped to see the world and what that looks like. For my work with men, especially, it has been reckoning with the pornification of sex and its inescapable impact on our understanding of sexuality. And I don't mean to gender that in a way that as if women are excluded from that. That is not the case. But its impact on men, especially young men, for it being the way in which they have come to understand what sex is, how pleasure exists, and even what they're taught to want, to be stimulated by, and to think about as they operate in the world. There's such a deep examination that has to take place with that within the church around, and it has to be honest conversations that move beyond shame, right, into healing, right? It has to move beyond just the that's bad, that's awful. If you participate in that, you are the worst with that. It has to recognize instead, like this is a power at work, a principality at work in our world that has misshapen uh virtually our entire culture when it comes to sexuality. It may not even realize the ways in which it is done, so that even how we respond to and think about what clothing does, how a body operates, what a proper response to, or how you take in and respond to, like that's this deeper work of healing that I think that has to take place before we can ever get to something like mutuality, because we have to understand what's shaping us to even have these thoughts or to respond with it, and that requires healing. Like, that requires grace and
Mhm.
compassion. Like that's not it's not a shame and guilt conversation. Does that make sense? Does that connect with to what you're naming?
Yeah, no, I love that. And I really have a heart for men to heal from this. I know with creating a course like It's a Man's World, the Genesis 3:16 effect, people often react to that, or men react to that negatively and think I'm going after them. But I really love men actually, and I want them to do well and to flourish along with women. And I know that that's how God has designed men to be, and so they're not ever going to flourish outside of mutual relationship with women.
Mhm.
So that's definitely a healing work that has to take place, and I think a lot of it comes down to returning to our mutual humanity. And I want that for men too. Like, I want women to live fully in their humanity and fully in their freedom and
Mm.
co ownership of the world. But I also want men to live into their full humanity, where I think there's been a lot of emphasis on men having the freedom to do as they choose and taking control of the environment around them. But there
Mm.
has not been space for men to feel the vulnerability of being human, the limits of being human, and you can't just ignore that part of yourself
Right.
and expect that to go well for you.
Yeah, and until you live in a community that talks about it and embodies this differently, I get why people aren't nat we don't stumble into it, right? Like it's this is part of the way in which God works. Like we're invited into this new community, this alternative experience of being human and flourishing that we would not encounter on our own. It's the gift of God. It's the grace of God at work. And if you have not seen men and women flourish together in mutuality, it is really hard to imagine what it looks like. And this is where I always often feel like I'm an evangelist for this. I'm just proclaiming good news because I see people who are trapped in something else. I'm like, there's this. I have good news. There's this other place where God reigns, where things function differently. And for my theological background, I'm part of a denomination that's ordained women from its origin. Women have been ordained as elders in the Church of the Nazarene longer than they've had the right to vote in this country. So this DNA has existed, and even when it wasn't embodied well because of other things that were going on, like the DNA was there. And because the experience I've had, it gave me the privilege of first learning to like work for women, like have a female senior pastor that I worked for, work alongside of in ministry, a whole host of women. And then as a senior pastor, God gave me the privilege of continually sending me younger women starting a ministry that I was supposed to mentor and create space for so they could flourish. And I had to learn a whole other set of conversations approaching that about how do I not live into some of my default understandings of this? How do I listen to them well? How do I value what they're doing and, sort of create space to flourish within that? So even with like the active pursuit of that, like in my life in ministry, there's been so much deep learning of what greater freedom and mutuality would look like, friendships, and these elements. As you talk to people who are trapped in a system far different than that, right? Who have never seen this happen and take place. Maybe they're within a marriage. Maybe it's women who are trying to figure out their space in it. What are the encouragements you bring them, or where do you point them to, or how do you sort of proclaim good news and freedom?
Yeah. I think those concrete experiences of like those concrete positive experiences are so important for people to have. And I don't know if there's really a replacement for that. Like, I don't know if you can theorize your way
Mhm.
to that. And I think that really applies to the conversation around clothing and sexuality and male female relationships, that it's really hard for a person who only knows women through projection to project what it would be like to know a
Mm,
woman as a fellow human being.
yeah.
Because by the very nature of having a relationship with a person, like, you cannot project what a real person will be like.
Hmm.
Um, so then I've experienced that too. It's not just men, where I would project an idea of like, well, if I come into close friendship with a man that I'm not married to, this is how that's going to play out. And, it's just asking for trouble. And you just can't have that kind of a platonic, like, brother sister relationship with somebody of the opposite sex. And it's really easy to imagine the worst case scenario. And then when you actually enter into those relationships and get close to people, you realize, like, that didn't happen at all.
Hmm.
And you need to see it to believe it. You need to experience it to believe that you could have a relationship with somebody of the opposite sex that is not sexual, that you could walk into a room where a woman's not dressed like a nun and not experience even a temptation of lust, because
Hmm.
you're not just seeing what she's wearing, you're seeing her, this person that you know, and her clothing becomes much more incidental because you have a lot more information about her going on inside your head at that point. So I think this idea of like creating distance between men and women to sexually protect them is
Hmm.
a really flawed approach.
Yeah, the counterintuitive part of the kingdom is it's actually in closeness where we develop empathy, compassion, understanding that allows us to see the full dignity of another person created in the image of God. And this applies across gender barriers in the same way it applies to racial barriers, ethnic barriers, national barriers, socioeconomic barriers. That what we see that in the ethic of the early church and what's espoused at least is no, all of those barriers. Right? If you want to go to Galatians 3 and get this, all of the gender barriers, the citizen, non-citizen, slave free, you've got to discover how in Christ all of these constructs break down and dissolve, because now there's this new creation, there's this new experience of love that allows for what couldn't exist inside of another structure. And I think pulling, as you just did, and articulate really well, gender into that and recognizing it's actually by learning how to draw closer together and have these conversations that we begin to see where the power dynamics exist, where some of the structural injustices exist, or where we are exposed to what's wrong within us, not them, and where
Yeah.
I have to change in order to love them as a child created in the image of God. So does that correlation make sense as I pull those two together?
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. And I think if people haven't had those concrete experiences, or they don't have access to that right in this moment, one thing that can be helpful is to point them to examples in the Bible. The New Testament has all kinds of examples of men and women working alongside each other as equals, as coworkers, and having a relationship that is, you know, obviously non-sexual because they're not married to each other, but they're still working together and like having a deep friendship, a deeply spiritual friendship. That's something that people can look at and say, oh, it happened there, maybe it can happen again. Or early church examples of female Christians, martyrs who were right alongside male martyrs. And that is really helpful for
Mm,
helping people to imagine an alternative where maybe we could actually face spiritual danger together rather than seeing
mm,
spiritual danger in the other person just because they're a member
mm.
of the opposite sex.
Mm. Wow, that's really insightful. What immediately struck me as you said that was many of the voices, the leadership voices, the prophetic voices, theological voices that have worked to keep men and women separate and or set up the rules by which, if you're going into ministry, here's how you protect yourself, right? We could think of things like the Billy Graham rule or things espoused by lots of different male leaders of how they keep themselves from temptation and falling, all have revealed the weakness and the lack of imagination from these theological leaders. So much so to the point of like, why are you the leader if you have no imagination for how you as an individual can be brought into healthy relationships with another gender? Like if you don't understand, see that, if you've never experienced it, why are you the one in charge, and why are we trusting sort of the witness of these things? If you aren't able to live in mutual leadership to begin with, like there's an invalidation to me in some of the theological vision being put forth. And I think how you named that, that's what immediately struck me as you named that.
Yeah. And I think that evangelical Protestant culture is especially weak in this regard. Obviously the Catholic Church has had its problems, still has its problems, but when you have a setup where it is expected that this clergy is shepherding the entire church, you're going to go, whether you're a man or a woman, you're going to go to confession and talk to this clergy who is going to be male. And that's a whole different set of issues. But there is a lot more imagination in those traditions for how women could be ministered to with men. And we don't have that in evangelical culture. I mean, it exists, but it's very rare. There's just much more fear of women than there is a sense of responsibility to shepherd women. And we are half of the church, and you can't just opt out of ministering to half of the church if you expect to be a church leader.
Yeah. Simple kingdom math. I agree with you, but yet we do, and we continue.
But yet we do.
But yet we do. That's amazing. I have 47 follow-up questions, but I'm going to limit our time and not keep just picking your brain for that. Give us a little bit of a pitch for the It's a Man's World Series, the idea behind it, and sort of what it covers, just so I know there are new classes coming up, but it's going to be going on, this curriculum is going to exist. I really want people to get into it. I think it's super helpful in these regards. Just give us a little understanding of what inspired it and what it actually covers.
Yeah. So the subtitle comes from Genesis 3:16, which is the verse where it's talking about, it's sometimes called the curse on Eve. I don't think that's the right label for it, but it's where God is telling her that the man is going to rule over her. And he's saying, your desire shall be toward your husband, and he will rule over you. And people may or may not be aware of the interpretation that's been around since the 70s, that desire of the woman is actually a desire for the woman to control the man. And he has to respond by re-establishing his rightful control over her. So this really started as my master's thesis project, which was on Genesis 3:16, and pushing back against that and saying there's really very tenuous logic behind this, and it does not have historical support. Like, nobody ever thought of this until the year 1974, which happened to be, right in the middle of second wave feminism.
Yeah.
So that's how it started, and then it kind of branched out into this course. We have 8 episodes that all explore different areas of women's lives where Genesis 3 impacts women's everyday lives. So we have one on work, we have one on clothing, which we talked about today somewhat. We have one on marriage and divorce, and basically just exploring like, how did this Genesis 3:16 effect kind of balloon out, and how do we see it today, and how have we seen it in history?
It's great scholarship. It has profound impacts on how we actually live. I can't imagine going through this with a group of people and not being stirred to really significant conversation around these issues. So can't recommend it enough. I think it's amazing work you and Haley did. So well done.
Thank you.
To take a master's thesis and actually turn it into something useful for the world, a minor scholarship accomplishment.
Yeah. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah. Well, we'll make sure in the show notes to give you lots of links to Rachel's stuff and to the Analysis Center. But Rachel, thanks for the work you're doing. I think your voice is really important in helping us understand culturally what's going on, and indeed offering some hope to people. And thanks for lending a little bit of your time to us so we could dig into some of your expertise and understand it.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Greg. I've really enjoyed our conversation.
Thanks for listening to Cruciform Conversations. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast on Spotify, iTunes, or YouTube. and to visit the Cruciform Reflection Substack at drgregarthur.substack.com.